All right, EMP1 students, in this video we are going to talk about the meninges. So we'll return to our objectives. So we're here at the 3 and 4 objectives for chapter 13. So we're going to talk about the meninges and also talk about meningitis. So this is and we have talked about we have talked about the meninges in lab. Actually, we talked about cranial meninges and spinal meninges. So hopefully you remember the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater, and that's kind of the order that those connective tissue layers are in. If we're going from the outermost layer, that's dura mater, the middle layer is arachnoid mater, and the internal or innermost layer is the pia mater. So these are the connective tissue layers. They're there for protection primarily. They will, and we'll look at our picture down here. So this is our skull bone here, and so the meninges start right below that. So we have this meninges that are kind of separating and protecting the brain tissue from the hardness of the skull bones there. You'll also notice that there's blood vessels. I got a couple of them here represented. There's also blood vessels that run through the meninges, so they're kind of protected as well by the meninges. And then this is our subarachnoid space here. So that is where the cerebrospinal fluid flows. So the meninges allow for that cerebrospinal fluid to flow through or circulate through the areas surrounding the brain and the spinal cord too, but we're going to kind of focus on the brain meninges or cranial meninges in this video. All right, so those are our meninges. So the next thing that we'll talk about is meningitis. So that is the inflammation of the meninges. And some of you may be familiar with meningitis. I think they have like a little box that talks about meningitis, but it just means that the meninges become inflamed, and a lot of times the cause is an infectious agent or a pathogen, something that causes disease. So primarily it's usually a virus, or it could be bacteria that cause it. Your symptoms can be fever and headache and vomiting, those kind of things. And if it's a bacterial infection that's causing the meningitis, that can be could be life-threatening. So that one's usually the symptoms are a little bit more severe and a little bit more concerning. So definitely need to treat that aggressively, hopefully to prevent any sort of long-term problems, damage, or death. Whether it's a virus or a bacteria, they are contagious, and it's usually spreads in areas where there's everybody's in close contact. So usually like college dorm rooms and military barracks is where everybody kind of sleeps in one big room. So they see it spread pretty rapidly in those situations. So they do have vaccines that I usually recommend or require certain people to get, so people going into college or people going into the military, and it'll protect them against like the most common bacteria that can cause meningitis, so that will hopefully reduce the number of cases that can occur in those kind of situations. So that is our meningitis. So that is our little practical application to learning about the meninges is you can better understand meningitis and where that inflammation is at and what kind of symptoms that you get with it. So, all right, so I'm going to go to our objectives again. Since we have time in this video, we can go on and talk about the cerebrospinal fluid, since that's some of the fluid that's in the spaces created by the meninges, and talk about how it's formed and how it circulates, and then how it is also drained from the body too. And then we can talk about abnormality with it too. Okay, for the cerebrospinal fluid, we're going to slide down here. And we want to first talk about where it's located. So the first place that we will find the cerebrospinal fluid is in the ventricles of the brain. So remember that we learned about the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct. We identified those. There are cavities within the brain tissue that hold the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid, why we want to know about the ventricles, because not only do they hold the cerebrospinal fluid, some of it, they're also the location where the cerebrospinal fluid is formed as well. So if we remember back to when we talked about glial cells in chapter 12, one of the glial cells was called the ependymal cells, and remember that their role in the nervous tissue was to help produce and help circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. So they actually, if we look at the lining of the ventricles, like the wall of the ventricles, we'll see those ependymal cells. So here's our little ependymal cells. And they'll be lining the inside wall of the ventricles of the brain. All right, so in this picture, I kind of like this picture because they show the location of the ventricles in relation to the cerebrum and also the brainstem as well. So you can see it from a lateral view or an anterior posterior view here. So in these ventricles, again, we have cerebrospinal fluid flowing in them. And you will notice that when we get down, the cerebrospinal fluid gets down to the fourth ventricle. That's the most inferior ventricle. That fourth ventricle is actually connecting to that canal that runs down the center of our spinal cord. And that canal is called the central canal. So that means that cerebrospinal fluid is not only in the ventricles, but it's also going to, once it's leaving the ventricles, it's going to flow through the central canal of the spinal cord as well. So those are two of the places that we know has or contains cerebrospinal fluid. So the ventricles of the brain and the central canal of the spinal cord. But realize that we have these little, they call them apertures, which just means an opening or hole. Here and here, and I don't know if they show any others, I don't think so. But those little holes allow the cerebrospinal fluid to leave the ventricles and drain into the subarachnoid space that surrounds, that's part of the meninges, and it's the space that's around on the outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So that's how the cerebrospinal fluid will get into that subarachnoid space. So that's the third place or location that you can find cerebrospinal fluid, is in the subarachnoid space, and then in the ventricles and the central canal of the spinal cord. So that's its location. So now we're going to go down here because they have a picture that helps us talk about its formation. Yeah, so I'm going to use this picture. And what this shows is we just took like a sagittal section of the head, and when we're able to do that, then we can see inside the ventricles, and we can see this structure here. It's kind of like a peachy structure, and then notice that it has blood vessels in it. So, and there's a little, they call it a network of blood vessels in there. And so that network of blood vessels, every time we have that, use that term, network of blood vessels, or network of anything, we call it a plexus. So we learned about nerve plexuses. So this is a plexus as well, but instead of being a network of nerves, it's a network of blood vessels. So the reason that this plexus, and it's called the choroid plexus, the reason that that's significant is that's where cerebrospinal fluid is formed. And it's just a product of the blood. So the cerebrospinal fluid is formed by components of the blood. Now realize though, we don't get red blood cells, any of those big cells from the blood into the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is more of a straw colored, like a light yellow color fluid, because it does contain some parts of the blood, but not the parts that make it red in color. All right, so we have a plexus, choroid plexus here. We also have them in the, well, you can see one right there. We also have them in the other ventricles as well. So that is where we have the production of cerebrospinal fluid. And then remember, the ependymal cells are also going to be located there, and they're helping with the production of the cerebrospinal fluid too. So that's where, I guess, right, they're doing one here. That's saying that's where it's made, the cerebrospinal fluid. Realize it's made in other places too, in the other ventricles. And then, but they're just showing it if it starts at in this third ventricle. Then it will flow into that ventricle. So you can see it flowing into the ventricle. It'll head down the cerebral aqueduct, and then into our fourth ventricle, and then it will head down into our central canal. And then realize they kind of show an aperture here. They show one here where you can actually see the little arrows is what they're using to show the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid. So once it's formed in the ventricles, then it will flow into the central canal, and then also make its way through the little apertures into the subarachnoid space. So this is called the subarachnoid space. And realize that subarachnoid space will go all the way around the brain, but also surround the spinal cord too. So you can see the black arrows just kind of show the cerebral spinal fluid circulating. So realize that the body, those choroid plexuses, are continually producing more cerebrospinal fluid, and then we need to drain it. It needs to go back into the bloodstream because we're going to produce more. And we want like the pressure or the amount of that cerebrospinal fluid within these spaces to remain pretty constant, so like at a constant volume and pressure. Because if it doesn't, if we get like an accumulation of too much cerebrospinal fluid in here, then it's really hard to, that pressure of that fluid building up in here, it's not going to be able to go this way because we have a hard bone there that's not going to be, not going to move. So what happens is the pressure is exerted onto the brain tissue, and any pressure on the brain can disrupt those various cells and cause some brain damage. So we want to make sure that however much cerebrospinal fluid is formed, the same amount is drained, so then we can form more, drain the same amount, so we can kind of keep this volume and pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid in those spaces at a constant level. So, all right, so now we'll talk about where, because the choroid plexus is where we have the formation of cerebrospinal fluid, so where it gets drained, and we will zoom in on this, but these little areas here, they were called arachnoid villi because they're an extension of the arachnoid matter, which is our middle layer of our meninges. So you can see them there. We're going to enlarge, you can see some more too. We're going to enlarge that picture, or they enlarge that picture. Oh, sorry, there we go. So that way we can see it a little bit more closely. So we can see the arachnoid matter, and then you'll notice that this is the dura mater. And then there's this little arachnoid villi, a little extension off the arachnoid that actually passes through that dura mater there. And this little space here is where we have blood pooling. And so we want to drain the cerebrospinal fluid back into the bloodstream. So what happens is when the pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid starts to increase here, that'll cause this kind of to work as a one-way valve. And then any cerebrospinal fluid can pass out of the subarachnoid space and then get into the they call it a sinus, but this bloodstream here, and so that way we maintain the normal volume and pressure of cerebrospinal fluid in those spaces within and around the brain and spinal cord. So they call those arachnoid villi. So they're responsible for the drainage of cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so we'll talk about hydrocephalus in the next video. Thank you.